So, Jess, basically as much as you want to talk, go for it, because this is your chance. We're here to just have some discourse.
Can we get a little introduction?
Yeah.
I don't really know you that much. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, so Jess, give us a rundown on your credentials.
My credentials? Yeah, or your story, which is more interesting.
My quick story is I was raised in a Nazarene church. My parents became Christians when I was 8. So I was young, but I remember my parents' conversion, and then subsequently me and my brother and my sister became Christians. My brother and sister are adopted. I'm homegrown. So a lot of my story is influenced by my parents, because after a while going to the Nazarene church in our town, which my parents just picked because that was where our neighbors went, and our neighbors are the ones that led my mom and dad to the Lord. And then my dad's always my mom too, always on the search for something more. So they started hearing about missionary work, and within, let's see, by the time I was 13, we were starting to do mission trips overseas, and with a group called Youth with Mission, which is a non-denominational Protestant missions organization. And it's huge. It's sort of decentralized. It's not as, like, the Southern Baptists have a gigantic missions program, but it's very hierarchical. YWAM is basically the hippie version of that. Sort of born out of the Jesus movement in the 70s. It was founded with the idea that young people would go all over the earth and preach the gospel. So this captured my mom and dad's heart, and so we started doing just that. And when I was 15, my dad was a professor at the University of Idaho. He taught electrical engineering. He's a very smart man. And then he quit his job at the university and became a missionary full time. And we stayed in the States, so we didn't go overseas or anything. But so that was, then after I graduated high school, I was just going to go into missions as well. And in a strange way, I won't get into much detail because it's a long story, but God basically called me out of missions work. Normally God calls people into missions work. And I went to school. I went to audio engineering school. I went with the idea that I would produce music someday. That didn't work out. Instead, I ended up in video production, met my wife along the way. We had 3 children. And I've been doing animation and video production for the last, 10, 15 years. So, but all through that time, since God called me out of missions, I kind of went through a cliche, at this point, deconstruction period, which all evangelicals should go through, I guess. And so I found myself, not necessarily floundering in my external life. We're still going to church. I've got small boys at home that I'm raising them. We're still, nothing externally is being changed that much, but internally I kind of had a storm going on for, 10 years or so. And then that's kind of what brought me to this little corner and to be in fellowship with all you folks here, and is in the wake of Peterson, and then being a part of Paul Vanderklay's community. Really, God has, I guess, answered the questions that threw me into the deconstruction, and so I've emerged out of that into a fuller life, a fuller faith, and really grateful for it, and that's kind of why I'm here, is because it was so meaningful and helpful for me, but also I want to, like, I hope, I think this is meaningful and helpful for other people, and I just want to be a part of it. So.
Yeah, very good.
And the book of Job had a little something to do with that.
Yeah, so part of it is I had this, the book of Job just sort of haunted me for a while, because it's one of those obscure books, and mainly I was trying to figure out why the heck God was talking about Leviathan, and then immediately after Job is comforted. Like, so these two facts is like, okay, God seems to be proud of Leviathan, and this helps Job, and this was entirely confusing to me.
Even though you are living through it.
Right. Well, I didn't understand it in those terms, really.
Yeah. No, I just love that. I love that you're like drawn to the exact thing that you're going through.
Right. So,
without knowing it.
One of the things that happened to me while I was kind of, I don't know what to call it, as my faith was being built back up again, was the book of Job came to life during that process for me. And all of a sudden I had an insight, like why God might talk about Leviathan, and then like why Job could be comforted from that. And then, well, one thing led to another, and like my first conversation with Paul Vanderklay back in the day was me just trying to talk about all that stuff. Was like, hey, I found out this, and Peugeot said this, and it connects to this, and there's, so I was pretty excited about that. And then Sherry Suter and I did a podcast on the book of Job where we went through every chapter in as much detail as we could manage for like, I don't know how many, it's like 22 hours of podcast on Job. And then I'd still not out of my system really. So, if anyone knows me, if you bring up something adjacent to Job and I can wedge it in there, I'll definitely take the opportunity.
Well, Jess, can I start out with a particular question? I'm curious if there's anything that we in yesterday's talks and discussions that was like that gave you any new insight, or maybe a new way to talk about all that.
Yeah, I think just to start off, like what Father Eric, what you were talking about with the Psalms giving voice to things in our experience, giving you words and prayers to pray. That's really how I see the book of Job, because for anyone not too familiar with it, the book of Job is mostly poetry. And so you have like the introduction of the story where you're introduced to Job, the righteous man, and his family and all his wealth. And then there's this scene in heaven where God and Satan talk, and all these disasters are poured out on Job, and then so that's this sort of prose section at the beginning. Then we go through 38 chapters of poetry, which are these poetic dialogues between Job and his three friends, and then eventually a fourth friend, and then eventually God shows up at the end. And it's all poetic discourse. Like there's a small piece of prose there in the middle, but to introduce the fourth friend. And then at the very end, you have another piece of prose, sort of just telling the end of the story, and they all lived happily ever after, sort of. But the whole middle part, it's all poetry, and it very much is. It's a mixture of all kinds of laments and prayers and complaints and arguments, just as we can go through the Psalms, and they kind of give words that we can pray in all the depths of and widths of human emotion. Job also sort of gives that to you, like there's heights and depths that Job goes to that are that most of us fear to tread in, but Job sort of shows us the way. Like, you can go there, you can have a lament like this, you can say these words of sort of fiery judgment, and at the very end, one of the interesting things is that God approves of what Job said, and you're like, how can he approve of what Job said? That was insane, you know. and so, just like Job gives you all these words, the friends are also involved in this. So the friends, their poetic discourse is one of accusation, and eventually they come to condemn Job, and it's very interesting how that progresses. And so, you know, the Psalms are not, I don't want to say I'll exaggerate, they're haphazard sort of in how it's laid out in the Psalms. And so, like, if you just read Psalm 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, you can be like, I'm kind of jumping all over the place. Job, there's a progression through it. It's not a linear progression, I would say. Because I think it's difficult to read because the arguments aren't sort of laid out linearly and then answered linearly. It's more of this a mosaic, but there's a clear progression through it. It's sort of maybe like a liturgy of suffering or something, and it can give you a way to go through something, or at least see how Job did. And if you're familiar with like that whole poetic middle part, usually people read the beginning and the end, maybe God's speech, but and then like they're like, I don't know what they're talking about in the middle. It's just like they keep repeating things and it sounds terrible, but there's actually like distinct movements and things happening within there that if like as I've become more familiar with the text, I've found that like I'll notice these things in real life. Like I'll talk to someone who's experiencing something in their own suffering, and I'll notice like it's even like thoughts of Job's friends in my mind. I'll be like, oh, that's a thought of Eliphaz. You know, I'm like, you know, someone's complaining about something, and then I think in my mind, I wonder if you did something, and then I'm like, oh, that's what Job's friend said, and so, as well as recognize like when someone, this is especially helpful, like when someone is like complaining of their situation, of their suffering, and it'd be like to recognize Job in them, and of course Job also Job points us to Christ, where we can actually recognize Christ in other people as well. So yeah,
it wouldn't have glossed as well for Hopkins to have said, "For Job shines in 10,000 places."
right.
So, I mean, there's a couple of things that when I was thinking about some of the stuff I wanted to talk about, I'm going to selfishly partially tie this back to my talk yesterday, because one of the things that I was suggesting is that we need to be willing to look into the inscape of suffering and death. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the ways that Job is maybe the best that's ever been done. So
yeah, Job is, you totally get the inscape of Job.
Yes.
And
there's something about the fact that it's in poetry versus just like a prose story.
Right. And I think if you are able to like empathetically resonate with what Job is saying, you'll find that he reflects a lot of things just in the human condition. So like I was doing a Bible study on the book of Job, and one of the guys was like, "This is a really human story." I was like, yes, that's exactly it's just the story about people. So in all of its sort of misery. So it's I can barely get through things without crying.
Amen.
Jim, what do you? I'd be curious if what your thoughts would be putting, say, the love song of Geoffrey Prufrock or the Wasteland or the Four Quartets into dialogue with Job. Seems like there's a lot of commonality there, actually, kind of in terms of like what Eliot was wrestling with in his writing. Do you see anything there?
Well, I do. I was going to use actually a slide from Jess's program that he's got discussing the Book of Job on YouTube in the his first video on it, where he has a kind of really nice. Now I realize why you had such a nice video, because you're a videographer.
It's all coming together now.
Because I was trying to do some of that similar stuff with Elliot. I was like, this is hard. And yours is very beautiful. It's very, I mean, if anybody has seen it, it's very high production value. But anyway, he outlines the structure of Job in a, I don't know, 15-minute long thing. And it's just kind of graphically shown to you the structure of that poem, and it's a kind of gesture at what I think the whole book is saying, as Jess has partly revealed to me, and that is a kind of rightly ordered way of putting these painful things in that rightly ordered world, let's say. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'm going to get back to Eliot directly, but I've had this experience in my life. I think most people have probably. When I was young, bad things happened. A friend of mine died. My aunt, who I wasn't that close with, died in a very bad way. And as a young person, it's difficult to have the emotion that's right for that moment attached to that event. In other words, you can feel, or I remember feeling about those two particular events, that I wasn't feeling as intensely the right emotion at that time. It goes to your talk, I think, in a way that I didn't have the language, or I didn't have the structure to actually...
The cultivation
to actually have the right emotion about that. And I was almost aware of it at the time. I knew that I wasn't feeling that in the right way, and I wasn't able to express that. And then at other times, I felt this sense I talked about with Eliot, where there were, here's an Eliot phrase, there were squads of emotion within me that would come out in a kind of inappropriate place, or in an intensity that was inappropriate for the time or the moment, and it would be a kind of threatening thing. It would be a kind of scary thing that you knew you had to pull back because it didn't fit with the moment, or it didn't connect to it wasn't rightly ordered.
Are you saying that you were a teenager?
I was a teenager. And so I think overall there's this struggle in my life to put all those things in the right places. And then when they're in the right places, they can have the right connection to the feeling you're having, the emotion. It can be let out and become part of a communal experience in a way that fully exercises it, but not in a kind of way where it will be out of control, or that you won't lose the foundation, or you won't lose the sense of being in a safe place.
It's like, is that what you done?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, the question I was thinking was, did you have somebody who walked through that with you, showed you how to do it? Did you have somebody who educated it, or did you have to kind of go out and figure it out on your own?
I think overall in my life, because I grew up in a secular world, it was mostly up to me to ultimately kind of wander through my life towards some sort of ordering of that. Yeah. And ultimately Christianity became that for me. Mm-hmm. But then, where was that? You distracted me just a little bit, but I'll get back to it. Jess, when I gotta say, when I first saw Jess's presentation on Job, it was just a kind of little bit of a profound moment for me, because if you know Jess, he's willing to emote. And maybe he's not willing to. Maybe it just gets it. It just gets it. Maybe it just gets it.
I have no control.
But what I mean is that he was ready to do that. And I think about things like events in my life where the appropriate emotion and experience of it in communion with others is now better ordered. But other things like, just to get really existential here, the events in Israel right now. What is the right response to that? I mean, we could talk about the politics of it, and that would make it very ugly and difficult, and wouldn't be the right emotion. It wouldn't be the right reaction. The right reaction to that is lament about the state of humanity, and to feel that with tears. And where do we get to do that? In other words, where do we get to communally have that emotive experience that is really the rightly ordered experience for that and that reality that we are all a part of together. And and that is what, for me, Jess's presentation of it, and then Job for me really showed me, was that we have these great pieces of scripture, great pieces of literature that offer us that. They offer us that, and it's not just that in isolation with us reading a book, but it's that in communion with our fellow human beings. And so that's the way I really that it hits me. And
so there's something that I think we keep just like tapping on over and over, which is this connection between poetry and emotion, which is interesting because I think kind of a popular notion of poetry is that it is primarily about emotion, and that like you would write poetry to express your emotion, right? That like that's the main reason you would write poetry, is to express your emotional state.
Because the most common form of poetry we encounter is a love song.
Yeah, it's a love song, right? Yeah, or something about like depression or despair. But what's been really interesting is that what y'all have been saying is actually the opposite of that, which is poetry allows you to order your emotions. And I'm thinking about C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he talks about the classical notion of education, which is not mostly about giving people procedural knowledge or information, but it was about giving a person's intellect the capacity to rule over their passions, right? So he says the notion is that the head rules the stomach through the heart. And that he saw education and art as fulfilling its role in doing that. So I really love that, because you look at something like Ecclesiastes, which is also mostly verse, right? It's like you look at the wisdom books of the Bible, it's like, Ecclesiastes is in verse, and Job is in verse, and the Psalms are in verse.
And Song
of Songs is in verse.
Most of the prophetic books
are in verse. And Proverbs is in verse. So it's like, if I want to be wise, the approach to wisdom actually apparently has some connection with verse. And part of that, I think, is that it can be in your intellect, but it's also in your passions, right? It does both at the same time. And so in that sense, I think poetry functions as a bridge, because what gives name to, right? It gives name to these things. And then it also, you could go and sit down and say, I'm reading the Psalms today. It's a lot harder to be like, I'm going to grieve right now. Right. And so there's this, like, you have agency there approaching poetry in a way that you don't have agency in relation to your passions. And so I think this is totally critical. And I'm saying, yes, Father Eric, yes, Jess, yes, Jim, all of that. We should see this as, if you want to have any hope at getting your emotions going in the right direction, your passions going in the right direction. I love passions. I feel like a passion is even better than emotions in this case, because passion has the notion of something outside of your agency. Passion and suffering, right? Again, they're connected, because passions are something that mostly happens to you, particularly in this, like, in a moment. Now, over a long term, you've got a lot more control there, right? How you're shaping them. And we've just been saying this over and over and over. It's like, Well, how do you do that? Probably with the Psalms. The Psalms would be a great place to start with that.
Job is also good.
Job is also a
I
great
hadn't
place to
considered
start.
that because I haven't been reading the book of Job, every day. But yeah, it works. It works.
And so I love this thinking about Ecclesiastes and this notion that are the passions good? Well, are the passions bad? Well, which passions are you having at which time? That's the question, right? There will be time. There will be time. There's a time for these things. And so there's this sense in which if you want to have the right pattern at the right time, well, that's wisdom. Knowing what the pattern is at the right time, that's wisdom, and then bringing it about. Apparently, I would just say, like, looking at how people have tried to do this, verse and poetry is like absolutely critical to that. So one of the things that I want to take that and move it a little bit, because I was thinking about, I talked a lot about inscapes yesterday, and I know that's a new notion to many of you or all of you here. No, I have family here. It's not new to you guys. I've listened to me talk about this for like 10 years now. So I was thinking about Hebrew poetry in particular, and Old Testament poetry, and the book of Job. And like as a teenager, it's frustrating because they seem to just be saying the same thing over and over and over and over. But if you go and you pay attention, there's this sort of meditative quality of it, where it's like, I'll say it this way, and then I'll say it a little different, and I'll say it a little bit different, and a little bit. And so when I started thinking about that, and the notion of trying to explain an inscape to someone, like, what's this process of you in your intellect, like meditating on an inscape? I thought, that's what Hebrew poetry is doing. And so Job, I don't know, Jess, are there any particular places that like really stuck out with you? I can think of several places in Job where these beautiful meditations on his sorrow, where he'll like talk about his calamity as relating to, like, say, the four elements. He's like, the fire and the earth is swallowing me up, and I'm submerged in the waters, and like there's a gate. Mm-hmm. There's this just richness there. There's this richness. So I don't know. Does that prompt anything?
Yeah. Well, so like there's no like linear arguments, like I was saying, but there are all these threads that run through it. So I mean, people say that the Book of Job is one of the most beautiful works of literature in the world. And I'm watching Emma, and she's crocheting there, and like literally, this is how the Book of Job is written. It's all these intertwining threads, and so you can actually like kind of pull on some of these threads and like work your way through, and there's actually progression that happens. So look, one example is Job says, he says there is no art. So for Job, his calamity has presented him with some huge existential problems, and his relationship with God is now hidden, and he doesn't understand what's happening. So he frames this as a court case, and he's going to he's like, if only at first he does this. He goes, if only we could meet in court, and so maybe we could sort this out. And then he says, there isn't an arbiter between us. And so an arbiter would be someone who'd make a decision for one party or the other, or some sort of compromise. And very often, a lot of things in Job are apophatic, so it's in the negative. So he'll say, this isn't a possibility. There's no arbiter. There's no court case. But later on, then he says, I can't remember exactly, but he talks about a mediator. He's like, if there was only a mediator between us. So we've moved from an arbiter to a mediator. And then later on, he says, I know my Redeemer lives. And then, so now we don't have a mediator anymore. We have a Redeemer. Mm-hmm. And then he sees God face to face. There's no arbiter, mediator, or anything. And actually, Job sort of ends up becoming the arbiter, mediator, Redeemer for his friends in the end. Like this he ends up becoming the things that he was desiring. So and this is just the case. Like how many people that have gone through like a terrible thing, and then so I have some friends, they went through a terrible miscarriage, and then they actually started an organization to be there, that hospitals could refer people to them if they've had a miscarriage and they need a group setting to talk about it. So they organized this thing, And so you actually like will end up doing the thing that you wish you had.
We comfort others with the comfort
Yes.
that we ourselves have received.
Yeah.
Like Paul says.
Right. And so that's sort of an example of what was the
I was asking this sort of meditative Hebrew
Right.
poetic
So
aspect. Yeah,
this is
this sort of working over and over.
Yeah, so
a
you
thing.
can see Job is working on this idea of a court case, and he has this idea of a figure of an arbiter that ends up, as he's, lamenting and working through this and yelling at his friends, and his friends are chewing him out. Then he gets to the idea of the mediator, then he gets to the idea of the redeemer, and then he ends up seeing God. And so I think that's just how it works. It's this meditation and this and you could say that this was, this is the point of Job. This is how things get created in us. And I've said before, and I like to say it, that I think the story of the book of Job is like the making of the human being.
There's so much in that is so good, Jess. Okay, what? Sorry, do you have something, Paul?
I've got
Yeah.
something I want to try and tie together here. So Dr. Jim, you talked about your experience with, say, realizing that you need to educate your passions so that they can come out appropriately, and not having, let's say, a mentor or a community and to do this with until you became a Christian.
Well, I would say no, actually. I
Okay.
would say that evolved over time
Okay.
in a kind of incremental way where things came together in many different dimensions of my life. I became a physician, and there's a whole structure of experience there in caring for people and being present with suffering. And then there's my undifferentiated draw to kind of literature and beyond literature, scripture and looking for those moments when it would kind of be a vehicle to organize things, let's say, in the sense of reining in my passions, and then ultimately a house is built. And my Christian life is like a lot of people's. I think it's got a lot that's involved in my own idiosyncratic journey that I've been on, but it's also in reference to an external culture that I'm part of, that is a Christian culture, that is a church family, that is it turns out that it happens to be, because of the journey that I've been on, a kind of evangelical Protestant community that I'm presently part of. Is that exactly lined up with the journey that I personally have taken and come to in terms of my Christian faith, which is this idiosyncratic thing that I was just describing? They kind of fit on top of each other, but they don't really match exactly. I definitely have a draw towards the sacramentalism and the liturgical world that is offered by the high church tradition, and have a deep, let's say, desire to potentially be a part of that or participate in that. But I also know that at my stage of where I am, and the communities, my family, my church community, et cetera, that I'm already involved in, that probably isn't in the cards, and might not actually even turn into an authentic experience were I to, follow Prufrock with Do I Dare to kind of jump out and say, hey, I'm going all in. I don't think that is actually the right thing for me to do. I think so. I don't know if that answers your question, but ultimately I think these kind of unmatching levels have actually come together into a kind of order that includes them all. Let's say I've got off the conversation exactly there, but that's where I find myself. And then this kind of community and being able to interact with people who I know are part of that kind of community that I do have a draw to, the community that you are a member of. It gives me not only a taste of it, but a connection to it, a real ability to touch it a little bit, and so that's where I'm at.
Yeah. So when you were talking about, having all of the being a teenager, basically having all of these, we'll say, undisciplined passions, some coming out too intensely, others not being there when you think they would be appropriate. I was like, that's literally me. Well, that was me, right? Yeah, it was me, and it was through cultivating friendships, especially, and working out my own salvation with fear and trembling in the seminary, that some of that really began to actually fall into place. And it's like, and I'm thinking about, Jess, you start reading the book of Job. How long was it before you wanted to talk to somebody else about it?
Oh, like immediately.
Immediately, right? Immediately, because you're starting to put your life in a good order, right? You're starting to resonate with this story. You're starting to move around a little bit. It's moving you, and that's like something that needs to be shared.
I have a funny story about that too.
And I'll just tell you, and I called up, I sought out Jess to talk to him when I saw his thing. It was something, and I couldn't figure out how to get a hold of you actually for a while. and so
You're a hard man to find.
not really, but I sent one email out to get a connection to you, and it didn't. No, there was no response that came back. So a few months went by, and it's like, I wonder, that didn't work. And I just couldn't resist it. I just said, I have to talk to you.
Keep knocking.
And then, it was that kind of experience for me, just with his expression of the things that he offered with Job. It was,
So just your story.
I was all excited, and so it was about the Leviathan stuff, and so there's like a group of guys from my church or whatever, and I started talking, and I probably talked for like 15 minutes, but I didn't, I kept referencing Leviathan this, but I didn't say Leviathan. I kept saying Lethvian for some reason. And I was 15 minutes in, and someone just looked at me and was like, "What's a Lethvian?"
Jess, you and I have shared a particular form of social pain on many occasions.
Yes.
So another thing I want to pick up that I really loved from this and from yesterday too, is this notion of time and relationship with poetry, and that I think is actually really important to just our approach to life and to reality, which is the notion that it's something that counteracts the notion that things you get it all in the first glance, right? Because with all of us, it's like, for me, this is my wrestling with what Hopkins has had to say for a decade. You've been praying the Psalms all this time. This Job keeps. Is your understanding of Job the same now as it was the first when you started on? Yeah,
it shifts and changes.
Yeah, under you all the time, and there's new, and then same with you and Elliot. It's obvious that you spend a lot of time with Elliot, and so I think one of the things that we should see here is that, one, if you want to approach poetry, just realize that what you should, and you kind of must, is that it's gonna be this long, this time is gonna be a component of it. That it's not the first thing. And in that way, it just mirrors reality, because human relationships aren't like that, obviously, right? And skills aren't like that, and disciplines, and all of this, it just brings this time component back into anything that we're doing, I think, where it says, and it is that interesting, weird sort of valence to poetry that I find, where good poetry it's simultaneously enlightening and hidden at the same time, right? It produces this kind of unmatched insight, and yet at the same time it can also be hidden and even maintain these depths of mystery, even as you're starting to, as you're seeing it. And so then maybe even deeper mysteries, you start to get into these things where you just it actually becomes an act of faith to sit with it and say, I mean, because I'm thinking about when I've read through Job for youth group the first time, I was like, what is going on here? it feels quite impenetrable to people, I think. And so maybe I'm just kind of conjecturing, maybe one of the most valuable things that you're doing, Jess, is to take something like Job and say, look, if you can have the faith to sit with something like this, like, believe me, like, there will be fruit. Mm-hmm. And I think this is go for it.
I don't know if it's actually appropriate to sit and read Job all by yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or sure.
Once.
Or just once.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I think these things are designed to be told around a campfire. They're designed to be appropriated in community. It's not supposed to be, I am the great figure who penetrated the mysteries of this text.
Yeah.
It's like you had that, like, it was all bursting out of you because that's what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, well, there's things in Job which it'll make a point like this, and then it'll make it the opposite point over here. So one of them is a good example is they'll talk about the lions, and the lions are a metaphor for the wicked, and so I think it's Eliphaz says he'll break the teeth of the lions, he'll crush them, and it was a metaphor for God's going to destroy the wicked. And then when God speaks at the end, I can even talk sometimes. Sorry. God talks about he talks about it in maternal terms, where the lion is taking care of their cubs. Sorry. I just get so overwhelmed sometimes. I'm just like, jeez. All right. But anyway, these points of tension. So you're like, well, God is going to take care of the wicked, but also God's talking in terms of like the lion taking care of her cubs, and there's the cubs waiting in the thicket. And these opposing images are meant to be held in tension to get something to happen within you. There's a, like, even if you do read it by yourself, like, you'll have to have a dialogue with yourself. And then if you talk about it with other people, like, these are the tension points. And then by posing the tension, then something happens where it's different than if you just said, all right, here's the answer. And so what you do is you put things into tension, and then it allows something to happen. And so then that's a meditative process, which then moves you through things. And you know, we're talking about like ordering our emotions or whatever. But one thing that's interesting is that, you know, it's not like our emotions are things that just sort of have to be dealt with because they're kind of annoying and like, because Chesterton says of God's speech at the end that God is explicit to the point of violence that it cannot be explained, and it being the world, creation. And so part of in the very middle, the book of Job is like a chiasm that kind of centers around chapter 28. And then chapter 28, it's talking about what is the wisdom of God? Like, what are the reasons God has? What is his wisdom for doing these things? And it's directly parallel to the question Moses is asking God, which is, God, show me your ways, show me your glory. And it's deeply intertwined with the question that Job wrestles with on both sides of the wisdom poem, which is, why do the wicked prosper and why do the innocent suffer? And the answer we get, and just to say what Chesterton said again, is it cannot be explained. And so this is part of the answer. And then so at the end of the wisdom poem, it says, the beginning of wisdom, the awe of God or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, awe and fear is not an intellectual position. It's something you experience. And I think what it's saying is like that the experience of that emotion will help guide you towards wisdom, because it cannot be explained. And so what God's speech at the end frustrates a lot of people, because they're like, God doesn't answer anything. And and to be fair, right. But he is actually saying, I cannot answer it. There is no answer.
Besides himself.
But look at everything that I've created. It's kind of the thing. Look at all of the cosmos. And so he's saying, I like to think of it in terms of what God said to Moses, which is also, you can't see me face to face. What you'll see is my backside, or what happens in my wake as I pass by. And so when God passes by, what we have is creation. And you can look at creation and you can see all kinds of things happening. You can see the lions and the Pleiades and Orion and the sea and Leviathan and Behemoth, and like you can't get that into your mind, but you have a place in this world. And so like to tie what you're talking about, Ted, is like Job's inscape actually has a place within the landscape of the cosmos.
Yes.
And in its messiness and totality. And God makes place for everything. So Job rightly goes through his suffering, but God even makes a place for the friends who wrongly accused him and condemned him. He makes a place by saying, bring a sacrifice and ask Job to pray for you. So Job becomes like this priestly figure. So now the friends have a place. And then like at the very end, you see the whole kind of world gathered into Job's home, because there's this feast scene at the end where everyone that he knew, all his family and friends, they come into Job's house.
When we talked about this, and you brought that up, and I'd never seen it before, and I thought, oh, It's a Wonderful Life.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because they all come, and Job's wealth is restored because everyone comes, and it's a gold earring, right?
A gold ring and a coin.
And that's where his wealth comes from. All the people coming back to him. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's the end of It's a Wonderful Life. And no wonder we love It's a Wonderful Life, because
It's the best movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like here they come and they bring it all in, and then it's like, and now, I guess we're getting close up to Christmas, so I can go for it. There's the tree of life right there, like adorned with angels, right? And there's the star shining forth from the tree of life, and then the entire cosmos are singing. It's like, wow, it doesn't matter how dead inside you are. It's just like you can't not be moved by it. And so the thing that has been bursting through all this is that, to quote Nate Heil, poetry is witness. Like that, poetry is a witness. And I love what you're saying about Job and a place in the cosmos, because ultimately poetry is not about answering questions. It's about finding your place, which is better than getting answers.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and it requires structure.
It does,
requires
absolutely.
And here I think about poetry this way, but maybe it's expandable to all of life. But still, it requires ordering things and structuring things. The point that I decided I had to talk to Jess was when I saw him read the 28th chapter in one of his videos where he does a poetic presentation with video of the 28th chapter. And it made me realize something, like you said, I hadn't noticed before, how that's a kind of a chapter that doesn't really quite connect with the other voices that are present in the poem. and it's kind of just sits in there, and there's wonder. I think there's people who question who is the voice that is actually speaking in the 28th chapter, somewhat like this disjointed nature of Eliot, but still it's like it stands out as a kind of moment of higher meditation, of kind of a higher meditation. And in order to see that, in order to notice that, it has to be in that larger structure of the whole. And,
Yes.
And in order to get to it and then meditate in that way on it, you have to have kind of, probably not even the first time through, you have to have already gotten through to the end, maybe even already got through to the end a few times, and then come back. And when you then get to it, it resonates in a way that isn't possible for it to have resonated had you not done that. And
It's kind of like we were talking about backpacking and how the joke was backpacking is one of those
Type 2 fun.
Type 2 fun where
Right.
you don't have fun doing it, but you look back on it, you're like, oh, that was fun. the book of Job, like going through that whole middle section is like, it's not fun going through it.
Type
Like,
2.
It's type 2 fun. You're like working through it. You're like, this is miserable. And then like you look back, you're like, oh yeah, that was kind of cool.
Well, okay, and this is one of those things that it's like, how have we not even been talking about this notion of taking that one chapter out and saying, here it is.
Yeah,
It's not,
it's
it's actually not even the same thing.
That's right.
And so there's this, well, this is about finding your place, right? The idea of Job's like, Job means what he means because of his place. So then I was thinking about Dante in the middle of Dante. We were talking about this earlier this weekend. There's this discourse that Virgil and Dante have about love and about how love drives all actions. And so the whole project is to cultivate your love towards the highest good. And then after that, Dante has this totally wild dream about the siren. And I won't go into the detail on it, but if you just had that discourse or you just had the dream, it'd be like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. I like that. But when you've gone through the whole journey and you realize that it's what Dante is doing across the entire Divine Comedy, and all 100 cantos are an instantiation of exactly what he's saying there.
Is that on sloth?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I know. It's like, listen, every possible connection you can make with that is, I'm pretty sure, is intentional, or it's his poetic genius working on a level he didn't even understand. Yeah, it's just so good. So in Purgatorio, it's the only time it's the only time you have a day-night cycle. So in the Inferno, it's always dark.
Yeah.
And in the heavens, there's always light. Okay. But in Purgatorio, it's day and night, and he can't move when it's dark. And so it's just so genius. He gets to the cornice where they're being purged of sloth, right? And he gets stuck halfway up. He's halfway on the terrace. He's like, his legs are on the steps and his torso's on the terrace of sloth. The sun goes down, so he's stuck. He's like stuck halfway into sloth, and you're like, okay, I get it. That's great. But then he says, Virgil, I don't want to waste my time. Can we at least talk about something useful? And you're like, oh, okay, also that works too. So then Virgil goes and they have this great discourse there. And what's really cool is they have that discourse, and then he has this dream, and when he wakes up, he's like, if I remember right, he's been moved up. Like while he slept, I think Virgil or someone else picks him up and moves him. And so it's working on all these different layers of
And I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction, but the same, talking about this structure thing, and it made, with Jonathan Peugeot and his introducing me to icons, I've started to think of Job, let's say. I won't go to Dante because we're just
stick on Job. We can talk about Dante later. We've got time for that later.
but an icon, gosh, I shouldn't speak of an icon from a Protestant perspective.
You have my permission.
An icon is this complex narrative that's kind of put together with all these pieces that each have their own meaning, and the individual part doesn't have its meaning unless the whole thing is there. And I see Job that way. It's like an icon. It's like this big image of one thing that has all these pieces in it.
Yes.
That ultimately have
This is the
meaning
inscape.
only because they are part of
Yes.
the whole. And so anyway.
Oh, well, Father John Manley Hopkins says that inscape is the soul of art. And so, as a good Thomist, he knew that the soul is the formal cause of the thing. And so when we're approaching art, it's like what you're saying though, like that's what he was trying to get across. That the way that you can approach something like Job and you see this pattern and the interrelation of that pattern and the way that things have their place in it and bring forth meaning, and there's even hierarchical importance to that. He's saying that is actually the pattern of all reality. That's like how we come into relation with anything, any word, any person, any object, any notion. And so in that way, it becomes a training for just how to be as a person, right? That process. So I love it because like it specifically trains you, say, in an emotion, but it also just, that is how we exist. Like, and so to be able to, Job is a harder thing to come in relation to than other things. And so sort of like, let's say that the ascesis of coming into relation with Job could actually be seen as preparation for approaching anything. And you get what's beautiful there, to, at least for me, with these big, something about the epic poetry, and my sister and I have had a conversation about this, and I still don't know why it happens, but the epic poems, they're sort of like, they're like type 2 glory is almost how I would say it, to take type 2 fun. There's this sense in which when you're reading through, like, this is for me personally, the Odyssey, nothing in particular jumps out at me. But then when I finish, it's like the saturation is at 11. I don't know why, but like the ocean is just and I'll go through, I can go back and read it, and I don't find anything there in particular. Or there's this weird thing that Dorothy Sayers says about the Divine Comedy where she would talk to people and be like, oh, the landscape of Purgatorio is so rich. And you go back and he's like, what's said about the landscape? Like, I don't know, like 6 or 7 lines in a couple of places. There's almost no description of it, but there's something there about once you've gotten through, there's this richness to it and it lives inside of you. And that's just, because this is what Job is doing, right? Job becomes a microcosm, right? Here it is, like here's the glory of the cosmos. This is your answer. And the answer is that Job is in the image of God, right? And so that should be why shouldn't Job, because Job and Eliot are kind of asking, it's the same thing, right? That what's the question? What are you moving toward in Proof Rock?
The overwhelming question.
The overwhelming question. Like you could say, like, what is Job about? It's about the overwhelming question. And his first draft, let's say, is to say, would that I had never even been conceived, much less been a baby and died immediately. Like, blot out the night on which someone said a son is born.
Yeah.
Right? And first of all, just to say, plumbing the depths of sorrow, like, when Job comes out of the gate, he comes out really strong, and the language that he... But the answer to that is that he's made in the image of God and therefore a microcosm, and that he should rejoice because that's all for him, and yet he's also for all of it.
Mm-hmm. So like George MacDonald talks about this, not in these terms, but he says the inscape, our own inscape, it matches the landscape of the cosmos. So he's like the world is man turned inside out. And so like when you see a tree, it's not just a tree out there that has its own thing or whatever. It actually matches something inside of you, and you experience the tree as something that well is already in you. But anyway.
But anyway, he says, just passing on.
No. To continue it in Job, there's this interesting thing I kind of mentioned already, that Job sort of talks apophatically. He talks in the negative. So you mentioned like how Job said, "Blot out the day of my birth. I wish I was never born. I wish there was no breast to receive me. I wish I went from the womb to the grave," and so he's it's very terrible. Like it's a terrible chapter, and Job is the first one to bring Leviathan into stuff. He says I want the priests of darkness to summon Leviathan to uncreate me, and you're like, all right. So Job is doing this. It's interesting because Job, like, you got to pay attention, because it's like, it's not totally nihilistic. He's saying, I don't know why I was created. I want to be uncreated. It's very self-sacrificial, I would say. He's not saying, like, I wish everything was destroyed. Nothing where he could have gone, or he could have been totally, and he's not suicidal either. He's not saying I'm going to kill myself. He basically is posing the question, why doesn't God just finish the job and just kill me? Why am I still here? There's no reason. I'm just suffering. And anyway, so he's speaking apathetically. He's saying, why was I born? Why was I born? Why was I born? And then you go to the speech of Job at the end, and they're basically kind of opposite each other in the book. And so they have this sort of relationship, and God is talking about everything in creation being born. He even talks about the sea being born and then swaddling it in the clouds. So the most terrifying thing in the ancient world, which is the sea where Leviathan lives or whatever, is this newborn baby born, and God's swaddling it in the clouds. And so this happens throughout the book. So Job, the other thing, like you brought up, where Job was talking in 9, I'll just read it here because he says, so he's talking about God. He who removes the mountains and they know it not, when he overturns them in anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. So he's talking about the shaking of the pillars of the earth. Everything in his world is now overturned and destroyed. And then listen to what God says at the beginning of his speech. He says, and Job's making a statement about God's the one who shakes the foundation. And then God comes back, and it's almost like a reflection. He says, where were... Jeez.
You want me to read it for you, Jess?
I can do it. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched out the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And so you see this it's almost like two images, one of the shaking of the pillars of the earth and one that's establishing, one that's in terror and confusion, and one where the sons of God are there and they're all singing and shouting for joy. And these and I don't think we're supposed to think of these as two opposites. They're actually supposed to be pieces of puzzles that fit together. So one is this shape and one is this shape. And so, like, as far as like the inscape matching the outscape, because God speaks in his speech here through creation, and he's saying the shape of my creation fits this part of you. So.
And that's not really an answer.
That's not.
I would say the other.
Father, what have you got?
Yeah. I remember being in seminary, right? And they're telling us, how to be good priests, and we're going over like a funeral. So what do we do at a funeral? And basically, the training we got was don't answer questions and don't try and give answers, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that as I was going through this, because that was actually the part of being a priest that I was most nervous about when I was in seminary, was dealing with people who were grieving and suffering and all of that. And I was like, I really would rather just give them an answer and be done with it, And then I was like, okay, how would I respond if somebody did ask me a question of, why did he die like this so horribly? And the only thing you can do in that situation is say, what sort of answer would satisfy you? Like, what could I actually say? Yeah. I'd just be like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Thanks for your time. It's like, that's not how we work, and just now hearing these reflections on Job, and now having a desire to go revisit it because it's been a while, really starting to think that that's what the book of Job, that's like the whole point. It's like, no, there isn't just an answer. There isn't some words that we can just play around with that fixes you, and so I can go back to whatever I was doing against that.
Yeah, no, I was talking with Mark about this last night, and it's not like there is an answer. It's not like there is an answer and God's withholding it. He's literally, like Chesterton said, it cannot be explained.
So one of the things, I mean, it's just made a really interesting thing click for me. So I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Brothers K by the Brothers Karamazov, or however it's. Yeah. So when Yvonne and Alyosha they have this really intense conversation kind of early on, and Yvonne is basically saying like, nothing can be done to justify the suffering in the world, right? He's like, I'm out. It doesn't, I won't accept it. But he says something really interesting. He says, I can see, like, I have enough almost like mystical faith to believe that something could make up for it all. Mm-hmm. Something, I wish I could remember, something so precious and beautiful that everyone would look at it and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. All the suffering in the world makes sense. And Yvonne says, even if that happened, I wouldn't take it. Mm. And so what's so interesting is like, that's actually the moral orientation that you have to be concerned about. Not, do I accept the answer or not? It's, can I believe that suffering can be redeemed? And that's actually more important than saying, do I get the answer or not? Because Yvonne is saying the answer, it doesn't matter if I get answered. I still won't accept it. So I mean, that's what and Job doesn't do that. Job says, like, I just want an answer. I don't know if I don't know if my insight's getting through. I don't feel, I'm looking at your faces, I can tell it's not. So maybe I need to let this one stew for a little bit longer, but I'm going to throw that out there. And if you come to some brilliant insight later on in the day, let me know.
I mean, he got his answer.
He did.
He got his answer. That was the presence of God.
Job.
Overwhelming presence of God answered his question.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is like, sometimes you can read it and you're like, I don't get what God is saying, but you have to see that Job does get what God is saying, and then you're like, what does Job get? Because it's not exactly clear.
So then is the answer for us that we need to be Job?
Well, you need to bring your complaints to God, and Job provides an example for that. And like you were saying about the Psalms and all that, like, you need to go to God yourself. Like, and then like, this is all about, like, you need to find a way to get to God to ask your overwhelming question to.
I think that's about it on this. Yeah. We're gonna break for coffee. Jess.
Thanks, guys. It was a
Thank you.
privilege.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing the story, man.
Yeah.